Hello, everyone. Salam, everyone. Thanks for joining to our tonight's program. We have a special guest, Professor Christopher Clohessy, who is a Roman Catholic priest and the professor of Shia Islamic Studies at the Pontifical Institute for Arabic and Islamic Studies, acronym at PISI, in Rome, Italy. He's the author of Angels Hastening, the Karbala Dreams, published in 2021 last year. Half of My Heart, the narrative of Zainab, daughter of Ali, published in 2018, and Fatima, daughter of Muhammad, published in 2017. And the good news is that he's currently doing research to publish another book about Ahlul Bayt about Abu Fazl al-Abbas, peace be upon him. Tonight, we will be hearing his lecture about Dreaming Karbala, which is a reflection about the book from the last year about Imam Hussein's dream. And I don't want to tell the parts. We are excited to hear about the talk by the professor. So Father Christopher, please, if you enjoy the knowledge. Go for it.
Good, thank you. It's a pleasure to be joining you. And of course, I'm offering you a reflection as a Christian theologian, but one who has made a serious study of the texts of Shia Islam. It was, of course, on this night in Medina, in the year 680, the 61st year of Hijrah, that the night that Al-Hussein was killed, the same night that Salama, who was the last surviving widow of the Prophet by this time had been dead for, half a century, and Salama was by this time a woman well into her 80s. And on this night in 680, Salama was torn from her sleep by a vision of her late husband, the Prophet of Islam. And at that moment, she joined a group, a very large group of Muslims who, no matter what their gender, no matter what their level of taqwa, and of course, taqwa in many ways, the ethical mark of true Islamic faith, no matter what their status before God, they were the recipients of dreams about Karbala, dreams and visions, mostly at night, sometimes also during the day, that were populated sometimes by angels or an angel, sometimes by the voices of the jinn, sometimes by the dust of Karbala and the blood of Karbala. And all of these dreams centered on this one single event. Now, there are lots of dreams, what I call prognostic or predictive dreams about the murder of Al-Hussein at Karbala. And these are well documented in the Shia books of hadith and also history. They don't often form part of the memorial services, the sort of majalis that are happening, especially in the first few days of Muharram. Some of these dreams occur even before the birth of Al-Hussein. Some of them occur at the moment that these angelic visitors come to the Prophet to congratulate him on the birth of his grandson, but then to weep with him and lament with him that this same grandson is going to be killed in the future. Some of these dreams occur after the event of Karbala, and they are often then directed at people who were involved in some way in the murdering of the Imam, showing them what punishment is awaiting them. And some of them happen on the very night of Karbala. Salama, for example, awakens not only from a vision of her late husband, the Prophet, but she awakens just in time to hear the voices on the air of the jinn who are now lamenting the death of the Imam. I think of all these dreams and visions, the most powerful, the most evocative, happens in the house of Salama. So let's take her as our central character for this time. It was a vision that happened 50 years or more before the Battle of Karbala. The Prophet of Islam is in the house of Salama, and then Jibreel arrives to talk with him, as he often did. And the Prophet gives an order to Salama that she must stand guard over the door and not allow anyone in. The Arabic is very clear. Absolutely no one is to be permitted to pass by her and enter in and disturb the conversation that is now happening between prophet and angel. But of course, somebody does arrive, a little boy called Al-Hussein, who does not want to be separated and kept from his grandfather. And so he pushes past Salama, who tries to stop him, bursts into the room, leaps onto the lap of his grandfather, the prophet, seemingly unaware that the room also contains an angelic presence. And there begins at that moment what I regard as the most powerful, the most haunting conversation in the whole of Islam. It is this conversation between Jibreel, the prophet, and Al-Hussein. Jibreel looks at Al-Hussein, points towards him, sitting on the lap of his grandfather, and says to the prophet, "Do you love him?" The prophet replies at once, "Of course I love him. I love him more than I love life itself." And Jibreel then replies, "Your community after you is going to kill him. And I will show you now the dust of the place where he will be killed." And Jibreel beats on the ground with his wing, stretches it out, and returns holding in his hand a pile of red dust. It is the dust of Karbala. This dust eventually is given into the care of Salama. She puts it into a glass vessel, and every day for the next half century, she watches that dust, guarding it as she tried to guard the door of the house until the night when the dust turns to fresh blood and Salama knows that Al-Hussein, her beloved Al-Hussein, has been killed. Her vision on the night of Karbala, seeing first of all her husband in a dream, hearing the voice of the jinn after these long years of guarding Karbala's dust. These stories have found their way into many of the texts of Islam, not just the texts of hadith and theology, but more interestingly, into the texts of history, into biographies of whole cities written by historians like the famous Sunni Syrian historian Ibn Asakir. So you may meet some critics who want to make us think that these accounts of Al-Hussein, of the angelic visit to the prophet, the dust of Karbala, that these are nothing more than the attempt by some Shia scholars to give a sort of angelic endorsement to the drama of his martyrdom. But the reality is that outside of the large body of Shia texts of history and of hadith, these accounts are found quite clearly with many details in the works of the great non-Shia historians. Nor are these angelic passages about Hussein a later addition. Sunni scholars were reporting these visions that the Prophet had about Karbala already in the 2nd, 8th century. We have to deal with these stories in basic narrative form in the most important historians, many of whom are Sunni, so that we have to regard these reports as much more than just a Shia reading of history or a Shia attempt to endorse the death of Al-Hussein. I would say to you that at its deepest level, beyond all the details of soil that turns to blood, the air pulsating with the beating of the wings of Jibreel as he moves between heaven and earth, beyond all of Salama's ineffectual attempt to guard the door and prevent young Al-Hussein from entering, beyond the proposition that the model of Hussein is a much better model than the Yazidi model and is in fact an indictment of all iniquity, a paradigm of defiant resistance against injustice. Above and beyond all of this, these reports detail for me the way in which a particular generation of people, and I'm thinking specifically of the Ahl Bayt, encountered the divine. After all, the whole of the Islamic ethic roots itself in the conviction that the most important encounter and relationship that we have in life is our encounter and our relationship with God. Therefore, for me as a Christian theologian, it bears repeating in every generation that if we were to treat the Battle of Karbala no differently from the way we treat other battles that we learn about in the schoolroom, the Battle of Waterloo or the Battle of Britain, we would be discounting the way that Karbala has soaked deeply, infiltrated deeply into the very fabric of Shi'i prayer and piety and daily life. And we would underestimate, but profoundly underestimate, the quality that the life and death of Al-Hussein has added to so many lives, the quality of life which his struggle has given birth to in the Islamic community, but more especially for me, outside of the borders of the Islamic community over the last 1400 years. It bears repeating in every generation that Karbala has never been understood, at least by the Shi'i community, as some important historical event that happened once and for all, played out on some dusty corner of Iraq. But on the contrary, that the memory of Karbala has been a constant remembrance, what the Greeks call anamnetic remembrance, a remembrance that actually makes the event present over and over again, that makes Al-Hussein's martyrdom actually and actively and substantially present right now for us, becoming for every devout follower the whetstone against which to test the metal of our own thirst for justice, or the whetstone against which to sharpen our thirst for what is just and for what is right. If Al-Hussein dies on the field of Karbala, it is precisely so that he can endorse the standards of the grandfather on whose lap he once sat in the presence of Jibril, suffering with his companions whose names we should never forget, so that all of those who come after him could inherit a life that is freer and better and more sober, not intoxicated by injustice. If that's the case, then this act of remembrance is the least that we can do for such a beloved protagonist, for such a powerful figure, through the rituals that are performed or the tears that are shed, but more especially through our own daily actions for justice, which are not just a remembrance of Al-Hussein, but commonality with his cause. That is the remembrance that proclaims, had I been with Al-Hussein, I would have died with him. Those daily acts of justice that we perform as part of our remembrance of him. It bears repeating in every generation that Karbala is an occurrence, an event that people actually inhabit, an event in which people actually dwell and build their lives, not just a memorial of Al-Hussein's exertion and striving on the field of justice, but a personal field of battle for every single believer, for anyone who has deeply engaged him or herself in the matters of justice, for any one of us who at any moment of our lives finds ourselves standing before such an example of injustice or inequality or iniquity that it stops us in our tracks. Those of us who every day of our lives have to make small moral decisions which paralyze us for fear that people will be against us or condemn us, or that we would lose popularity with our friends. Karbala does not invite us to avoid suffering, but rather to use suffering, even those small daily personal sorrows, for the greater good. it bears repeating in every generation that Karbala is a word that God has written into the hearts of humankind, a word like that God has spoken into human history and into human life, because it is a word that reveals the human capacity for justice and for courage, and invites the believer to step back for a moment and reevaluate, reassess what life should be, not something aimless and hopeless, but as a decisive and potentially fruitful thing. Karbala is a space, if you like, that God has designed in which he invites us to live our lives more intensely than we have in the past, to struggle more forcefully with the truth that demands to be told every day, fearlessly to make correctly those daily ethical choices that every human being has to make, no matter what their outcome may be. For me, as a Christian theologian, the martyrdom of al-Hussein was quite clearly the result of his own morality, his own moral stance, and therefore it becomes a paradigm for the struggle for justice, no matter how small that struggle may be, the struggle for what is true, for what is right, for what is moral, for what is just. It bears repeating in every generation that in Islamic life and piety, in its ethics and in its spirituality, God must always remain the focal point, the overwhelming presence. And that between such a worldview, that God is ever present, and its polar opposite, that so fills the world today, the idea that God is irrelevant and meaningless, in that gap arise personalities like al-Hussein, standing in the gap, embodying all the hopes, all the aspirations of whole societies raised up surely by God to beckon every distracted generation back to righteousness, so that in the present moment, if justice is wanting among human beings, al-Hussein's life needs again to be encountered and remembered as he summons ordinary people back to the field of battle to support him in the struggle against tyranny and oppression. Karbala is, after all, part of the aftermath of that revolution that was initiated by all of the prophets of God, ending for Islam with the Prophet Muhammad, drawing crucial links between the Abrahamic faith systems. In this way, for me, al-Hussein transcends all religious boundaries, whether that's creed, whether it's a boundary of nationality or race or language or culture, and he becomes the paradigm of the righteous struggle for every human being. Quite clearly, for me, al-Hussein is following a model of struggle that existed before him, that existed from the start, a struggle in the lives of all the prophets who brought God's message and whose struggle to make that message known was consumed their whole lives. So that in this way, the grandson of the Prophet of Islam is acting in accordance with Quranic principles. How, says Surat An-Nisa, how should you not fight for the cause of God and of the cause of the weak among men and women and children who are crying out? The broad overview of history sets the tone for the struggle of the Prophet, of the Prophet's grandson. Muhammad's establishment of the city-state, then the founding of the caliphate, the pressing need then for men like al-Hussein to rise because of oppressive rulers who violate the sanctions of God, who oppose the sunnah of the Prophet, who ill-treat God's servants. His action at such a critical moment of Islamic history is held by his supporters to be the greatest suffering, an almost redemptive act in all of history. But whatever the motives are that pushed Hussein and drove al-Hussein, and they are many motives, his martyrdom must be understood also as preordained, that by such a death, he becomes the model of selflessness for the community. By such vicarious suffering on behalf of the innocent, he sets in motion a number of socio-political reactions that to all intents and purposes, released in the faith of Islam and the message of his grandfather, a freedom from corruption and from oppression. I believe it bears repeating in every generation that the voice of Karbala can never be silenced, nor can its thirst for justice ever be quenched, nor can its message ever be treated as transient or temporary. It engraves itself on the collective memory. It urges all of those who hear it to fashion something new, to reshape their lives, to stand with absolute horror before every oppressive word, every oppressive action, to inhabit the places that Al-Hussein inhabits, to build justice with him, to wage peace with him. The research that I have been doing over the last few years has been precisely about the dreams of this extraordinary event. That dream of Salama on the very night of Karbala, of a long dead prophet weeping over the death of his grandson, that dream that pulled her from her sleep just in time to hear even the voices of the jinn lamenting what had happened. That dream was one of a whole series of dreams, pre and post Karbala, which now for me form part of an inextinguishable echo that resonates through the texts of Sunni and Shia Islam, especially the medieval text. After all, Islam is one of those religious traditions that easily embraces the secular and the sacred running on parallel lines, so that angelic visitations, dreams of angels bringing announcements, even visions from God, form a regular part of the Islamic historical texts in the same way that they do not ever form part of modern Western historical texts. And they are easily classifiable as eyewitness accounts, as in the case of the dream in Salama's house, when she, although she may not have seen the presence of Jibreel, knew that something crucial was happening and received the dust of Karbala as proof. It's into those dreams that my own most recent research has been, and it has been a work of great love, using the sources of the Arabic sources of Islam to trace those dreams down through the centuries, starting before the birth of Al-Hussein, when angels come with congratulations and weeping, dreams that predict the blood that is going to be shed on the field of Karbala. They culminate, of course, in the dream of Salama, in Salama's house, and her reception of that famous glass vial of soil, which she guards so faithfully, perhaps as a model of how faithfully we need to guard this event and all that this event means. She watches it every day in the same way that every day we should look at these models of justice to promote justice in our own lives. These dreams translate also into more ominous warnings. The warnings against anyone who had anything to do with the death of Al-Hussein, tradesmen and soldiers and workers in the camp of Yazid's army, threatening such terrible punishment against them, who even just by their presence expanded and increased the numbers of the enemy. I know that these dreams are not often part of the traditional remembrance of Karbala in the days of Muharram, but how I wish that they would be, because of the messages that they give to us and because of the movement between heaven and earth of Jibreel, eager and urgent that this message be made known. Karbala is the place, after all, where the Shia heart is to be found. It is the place where the Shia heart beats with the heart of Al-Hussein, the place where the Shia heart breaks with Al-Hussein's heart, as it challenges its believers, its adherents to live more devoutly, more deeply engaged with justice issues, to stand before any example of injustice with such fierce sadness, a sadness that runs deep down into the bones. It may well be that it was the Lady Zainab herself who began this oral tradition of Karbala, recounting the story in such a way that people said she sounds as though she has the tongue of her father Ali. Nonetheless, that event, through her telling, ends up inscribed on the hearts of countless generations who pass on the story of Al-Hussein's martyrdom to the next generation. And I would believe that these dreams in the same way have been passed down from generation to generation, and that as we read them today, this visit of Jibreel, the voices of the angels lamenting and congratulating, that we can catch the strains of those authentic voices that have come down to us through the years and that ring out as loudly as they rang out first in the house of Salama. I thank you for the honor of allowing a priest of the Christian tradition to talk to you about these things. They are, for those who know me, things which are very close to my heart and people very close to my heart. And it is always a joy for me to be able to give a Christian perspective of the extraordinary lives lived by Al-Hussein, but not only Al-Hussein, but also by his sister, the Lady Zainab, the extraordinary lives of Al-Abbas, of Lady Fatima at the very beginning. And so it has been my honor to spend this time with you tonight. And I hope that this will not be the only occasion when we are able to share.
Thank you so much, Professor Clohessy. We all enjoyed the depths of knowledge and also the way you touched the problem and the issue of dream. And as you suggested, it would be very good for our Muharram commemoration to bring that concept as part of our the remembrance of those events, not just what happened during the Karbala, but also tracing back from the Imam before the birth of Imam Hussein all the way to the dreams that were concurrent with that tragedy. Thank you so much, Doctor, to be with us tonight, and we will looking forward, all of the ones who see this now and also afterward, to follow up on the 3 books that you have written so far, and we are looking forward for the book about Abul Fazl al-Abbas. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Every blessing.
Have a great one. Bye.